There's a mistake that I've seen startups and brands make over and over. And on the one hand, I can kind of understand why they keep making this mistake. If you don't think too hard about it, the logic of the decision kind of makes sense. And if it works out, it's such a hack to level up your business. But I've worked with a lot of growing brands, many of whom have made this mistake, and I've almost never seen it go well. It's when they hire some middle manager from a megacorp in their industry, hoping that they'll lead their brand to the promised land. Like some startup direct-to-consumer beauty brand hiring some middle manager from L'Oreal. Their hope is that this person will somehow help their brand reach those heights. They think that megacorp is successful, so this person can bring all the best practices and knowledge over to help us. They think if it's working at the megacorp, then those are secrets we can use to grow too. But there are several reasons that attempt almost always falls flat on its face. And almost every one of these that I'm going to go through, I've experienced firsthand multiple times. Number one, they haven't built shit. There's a big difference between building something from the ground up versus just showing up and sliding into a machine that's been running for decades. A startup means constantly solving problems and dealing with unknown unknowns. For example, a lot of the systems and processes that are well established in a megacorp don't yet exist in a startup. A growing e-commerce brand doesn't have an HRIS system to manage employees. There's no process for interviewing and hiring. They don't have a policy for expenses. There's no ticketing system for tech issues. They might not even have a project management tool implemented yet. Most tools and processes are good enough approaches that a startup with limited resources implements to just get through the next few months. They know it's not perfect, but it gets the job done. But it takes a certain skill to be able to identify a problem and figure out certain solutions that you can implement with the resources you have. Maybe nobody else does it that way, but for your current circumstances, it's just the right fit. For now. Because in reality, for a growing brand, there's a ladder of sophistication for solutions. At the beginning, you'll implement certain solutions that don't make sense when you get a little bit bigger, and that's okay, you just trade up. But someone from a megacorp has only experienced a final product. They've never had to identify a problem, nor concoct those simpler half measures that a startup pragmatically has to implement. Hell, they don't even know what it took to put that final product in place in the megacorp. They just know it's there and it's all they know. Because it works just fine at a megacorp, they don't realize why it's not a great fit for a startup. On top of that, they're not used to adapting to changing circumstances. Everything just kind of works, or if it doesn't, there's not much motivation to change it. A megacorp is like a massive ship and it has momentum, so you just sail along with it. But in a startup, you constantly have new problems and limited resources. So you have to figure out the best solution here, which sometimes means breaking an old solution and coming up with a new solution there. For example, I worked with a brand where they had a middle manager from a megacorp come in and implement a very rigid budgeting process. They didn't have the resources to do the sort of sophisticated budgeting process that was done in the megacorp, so they just said, let's just take last year and increase it by 50%. That's not a very sensible budgeting process to begin with, but what's worse is that when their ads took off, they weren't willing to deviate from that budget. They wouldn't spend more no matter how good the results were because the budget said so. They learned that you have to stick to budget without understanding how you make a good budget or why sticking to it even matters. Number two is that they're used to too many guardrails. A growing brand is fragile. Each person in a small brand has a lot of different responsibilities and therefore a lot of power. Everyone's used to wearing a lot of hats because you need to get a lot of different things done by very few people. At the same time, each one of these people usually have a lot of freedom. There aren't enough resources to have layers of checks and balances at every step. Not only does it take up time and money to implement a check, but it also slows the process down. And not having checks, sure, it's risky, but a startup is built on risk. Megacorps, on the other hand, usually have tons of guardrails to minimize errors as much as possible. Their processes have been around for a long time, and they've made enough mistakes to set up controls for basically everything. Every time a mistake is made, you think of some guardrail you can put in place to avoid that mistake happening in the future. And enough time passes and you end up with a ton of guardrails everywhere. But megacorps can afford to do that. So for example, in a startup, if you forget to place an inventory order, that means you might go out of stock, which means unhappy customers and lost revenue. Not good. You don't really have the guardrails, so you hire people who are independent and have good attention to detail. But a mistake like that is much harder to make in a megacorp. They have sophisticated ERPs, forecasts, and a team dedicated to purchasing inventory. Each one of those steps had their own checks built in and their checks on one another. That's why people don't actually need to be that competent to function in a megacorp, which also makes sense. A megacorp needs a lot of people, so they can't have every one of those people be elite. In a megacorp, there's just too much at stake, so there are tons of guardrails to keep people from screwing up. So if you hire someone from a megacorp who isn't used to working without guardrails, their risk of making a mistake is much higher. Number three is that they move and think slowly. Megacorps make money just because they exist. They've been around for so long and have so much momentum, they don't really need to innovate or change, at least not much. The additional value that comes from a cool new idea or a suggested improvement is just a drop in the bucket, so the incentive to implement a change is pretty low. And even if it is a great idea, rolling it out is a massive project. And if it's rolled out incorrectly across a massive organization, then it's a ton of work to fix. so they're incentivized to do things very slowly and cautiously. People in a megacorp are used to projects taking 6 months or even years. Part of that is because they need to plan every little detail, since each step could be a massive move that affects hundreds or thousands of people. Part of that is because each change can have impact on multiple different functions, and every function has their own team, so every stakeholder needs to participate in the process. And part of it is simply because the cultural norm is to just do things slowly, so it's not unusual for there to be 7 meetings before any actual steps are taken. On the other hand, in a startup, a project can go from idea to live in a week. Few people wear many hats, so there are fewer stakeholders. There are fewer resources, so less time to waste. A startup's also got a lot of available upside, so it's worth the risk to test and learn. And startups also tend to be nimble, so worst case, if a bad decision was taken, you can also course correct pretty quickly. For a startup, done is better than perfect, and for the megacorp folk, they're not ready for that. Megacorp people are notorious for bringing a lot of corporate speak to meeting and bringing much more of a let me think about that attitude rather than, alright, cool, let's try it out and see what happens. Number 4 is that there's too much hand-holding. Megacorps have tons of support departments. They have separate people to update the website, to pull reports, to do analysis, to mock up images. Everyone is a cog, so they just need to do their limited set of responsibilities reasonably well, in theory. And people also get lazy because when they hit a bottleneck, they think to themselves, well, it's now that person's job, and they absolve themselves of any responsibility for a thing not moving forward. But in a startup, you have to be self-reliant. You might not be able to do most things exceptionally, but you need to be able to do enough things well enough. Every job has to be handled by someone, and you're just as good a person as anybody else to handle it. Many of the things that need to get done, nobody knows how to do, but all the information's on the internet, so you can go and figure it out. The megacorp people have difficulty not having someone to send their requests to. They're usually not the type to roll up their sleeves or be scrappy, and they usually can't figure out how to do things that they're not taught by someone else. If they don't have support departments that they can send requests to, or staff that they can delegate things to, they're not going to be very happy. And number 5 is that the competency is opaque. In a megacorp, if you're a manager, it's very easy to take credit for the competency of your team. You benefit from the halo of the accomplishments of other teams, even if you had nothing to do with them. And frankly, it's very easy to compensate for incompetence by just schmoozing your way to the top. There's a lot of corporate politics in a megacorp, and most megacorps have a lot of dead weight, so you don't need to do that much to slowly rise to the top. Megacorps have been around for so long that there are systems and training for everything, and they're designed so that it's hard for people to fail. So just by being around, you can kind of fail upwards. Hiring people is difficult, so megacorps are designed such that every hire is at least functional. And in fairness, it is best if you can design a company such that even an idiot is valuable. But in a startup, the success is directly tied to the competence and the effort of the small team. There are no systems or training, there are very few resources, and a lot of problems to solve. So you can't really hide your incompetence behind other people, because a startup can only thrive with competent people. A person in a startup knows that they're going to have to work really hard, and they're excited by that. But the kind of person who enjoys being in a megacorp is usually the type of person who enjoys getting 1 to 2 hours of real work done in any given day. Now, in fairness, some people from a megacorp can succeed in a startup. Those people are often frustrated by the megacorps and are attracted to startups because they want to have more of an impact. However, a lot of megacorp hires go into a startup without the necessary humility. They think that if they were successful in a big company, then working in a small company is going to be easy. But those people are the ones that are doomed to fail. But if you're watching this video, chances are you've got big plans for scaling your e-commerce brand. So I'd recommend watching this video for some tips on how to use a financial forecast to help plan your scaling strategy. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.